On a previous video, I talked about how Ronald Reagan and his three-legged stool coalition ended up reshaping the Republican Party, and how the George W. Bush presidency ended up obliterating the hawkish foreign policy faction of Ronald Reagan's coalition. Long story short, 9/11 happened.
9/11.
The neoconservatives were all like, let's go bring democracy to the Middle East. And, well, things did not go according to plan.
Oops.
Today, I want to talk about the economics leg of Reagan's coalition, characterized by advocates for freer markets and fiscal spending and taxing policies. Some have traced Reagan's economic agenda back to Barry Goldwater, who, despite losing the 1964 presidential election in a landslide, had a profound influence on the actor-turned-politician. And from the looks of it, Ronald Reagan was also influenced by free market economists like Milton Friedman.
I don't think it's an exaggeration to call Milton Friedman's Free to Choose a survival kit for you, for our nation, and for freedom.
Either way, by 1980, after a period of inflation, stagnation, and gasoline shortages, Americans were ready for something new on the economics front. At least that's an impression I get from the back-to-back ass-kickings the Democrats suffered at the hands of Ronald Reagan, who, despite any economic problems during the 1980s, overall presided over an economic boom, especially in the consumer electronics market. And somehow the Republican Party went from a party that says stuff like this:
everywhere in the world, and especially here in the United States, we need to keep government on the sidelines. Let the people develop their own skills, solve their own problems, better their own lives.
To engaging in class warfare while favoring government intervention in the economy, leading many to wonder what the hell happened to the Republican Party. On the economics front, I think a few points are worth mentioning. One, the Republican Party long had an economic populist faction, perhaps represented by the likes of Patrick Buchanan, who worked in the Nixon administration, Ford administration, and Reagan administration, and began to advocate for protectionist economic policies in the early 1990s, going as far to challenge Republican incumbent George H.W. Bush in the 1992 Republican primaries, getting almost 25% of the votes. It might also be worth noting that for better or worse, protectionist economic policies tend to play well to voters in Rust Belt states, states that are also crucial battleground states in close elections. One could also point to the trend of large corporations being headed by liberal executives, especially amongst large tech companies from Silicon Valley and Washington State, who like to virtue signal on political issues and in general support left-wing political causes. However, I think one major event that demoralized conservatives on the economics front was the 2008 financial crisis, which happened at the end of George W. Bush's 8-year presidency, resulting in massive government bailouts for banks and other large corporations.
First, the federal government will use a portion of the $700 billion financial rescue plan to inject capital into banks by purchasing equity shares.
But before we get into all of that, let's briefly discuss the history of regulations on banking, finance, and housing in the United States. The debate over banking regulations dates all the way back to the founding of the United States, with Alexander Hamilton advocating for a federal central bank, while his opposition, notably the likes of Thomas Jefferson, favored banking to be centralized at the state level. Hamilton would end up getting his way with the establishment of the first bank of the United States, which collected tax revenues, secured government funds, made loans to the government, government, managed government deposits, and paid the government's bills, while also operating as a commercial bank and issued banknotes. Although other banks also issued their own notes during this period. The Bank of the United States had to be reauthorized every 20 years. By the 1830s, President Andrew Jackson would veto attempts to reauthorize the Bank of the United States, letting the establishment expire, temporarily bringing federalized central banking to a halt. However, this did not mean that the banking system in the United States was exactly laissez-faire. By the time of the American Civil War, an attempt to raise money for the war effort, Congress passed the National Bank Act, which mandated that banks buy U.S. Treasury bonds before issuing banknotes. This would make business for banks complicated, especially after the government increasingly paid off its debt, making government bonds more difficult for banks to purchase. To make matters more complicated, banks were effectively prohibited from interstate branch banking. Now, like today, where banks like Wells Fargo and Comerica operate nationwide. The restrictions on branch banking made banks less diversified, more reliant on local economies, and thus more vulnerable to local economic downturns, and thus less equipped to manage emergencies like, say, a liquidity crisis. The combination of branch banking restrictions and U.S. bond requirements made banking in the United States very unstable, especially when compared to a country like Canada.
Yes. Canada,
which also had no central bank during this period, but was far more stable due to a freer environment. By 1907, the United States would be hit with a severe financial crisis, which prompted financier J.P. Morgan to rescue several banks and trusts, helping America avoid a much more severe economic depression in the process. However, by this time, the political landscape in America had shifted dramatically. The trend of so-called progressive politics, characterized by a distrust of big business and free markets, and likewise favoring more government involvement in the economy, had come to dominate the entire political spectrum. And along with the progressive era, the desire to resurrect central banking in the United States had arrived. By 1914, Congress would pass the Federal Reserve Act, which would be signed into law by President Woodrow Wilson. The Federal Reserve's initial purpose was to do wonderful things like act as a lender of last resort, and overall stabilize the American economy and ensure that economic crises are either thwarted or minimized, essentially nationalizing currency in the process. And after that, the United States of America would never again suffer through an economic crisis. Wait a second, that doesn't sound right. Oh yeah, just 15 years later, the United States would kick off the worst economic crisis in its history.
Oh, come on!
And after President Herbert Hoover's attempts to turn the economy around through various government intervention measures, Americans decided to give good old Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the Democrats a chance to plan the American economy into prosperity, who also failed miserably to do so, but nevertheless, the United States got some new banking regulations along the way, such as the Banking Act of 1933. This act is perhaps best known as Glass-Steagall, which was notable for separating commercial banks from investment banks, with the logic being that securities made banks more risky and less stable, and thus making depositors even more vulnerable to losing their money because of risky decisions made by banks. But perhaps the most notable legacy of Glass-Steagall was the creation of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Chances are, if you walk into any standard bank in the United States, you will see somewhere that your money is secured up to $250,000 thanks to FDIC, which sounds great. If you put your hard-earned money into a bank and your bank makes boneheaded investments that cause the bank to run out of money for you to withdraw, or the bank outright collapses, like with this monumental goof over here, no worries. FDIC will make sure that you can get up to $250,000 of your money. Although the cap was initially $2,500 in 1934, and increased to $5,000 the following year, and obviously that limit has increased a few times since. But another reason for the creation of FDIC was that it would prevent runs on banks, which at the time were believed to be contagious, even with healthy banks. One key problem with this idea is that it creates what is called moral hazard in banking. If a bank, or anyone for that matter, is protected from the downside of making a risk, then chances are they will be even more willing to take risks. Even President Franklin Delano Roosevelt acknowledged this fact about FDIC, only passing it as a compromise to get the overall legislation passed, which led to more government regulations on banking in effort to reduce the moral hazard created by FDIC. According to Don Watkins, FDIC would lay the grounds for the government's too big to fail policy, as FDIC would be empowered by the Federal Deposit Insurance Act in 1950 to bail out a bank when the FDIC board determines that the bank is essential to provide adequate banking services in the community. And then there was the National Housing Act of 1934, which was passed in effort to make homeownership more affordable in the United States, establishing the Federal Housing Administration and Federal Savings and Loan Insurance Corporation. But for this video, the most notable feature of this act would not come until it was amended a few years later, establishing the Federal National Mortgage Association, better known as Fannie Mae, which is a government-sponsored enterprise that purchases FHA-insured mortgages from private lenders. Congress and President Roosevelt would also pass the Securities and Exchange Act of 1934, which established the Securities and Exchange Commission. And after World War II, the economy seemed to do well. At least for a while, there was no major banking or financial crisis. In 1968, as part of President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society program, Congress passed the Housing and Urban Development Act, creating the Department of Housing and Urban Development, as well as Ginnie Mae, which was similar to Fannie Mae, but more explicitly government-owned, whereas Fannie Mae was quasi-privately owned, where the American taxpayers assumed the risks of the government-sponsored enterprise. President Johnson and Congress would also dramatically expand the welfare state, which required the government to borrow and spend at even higher rates to pay for the expanded welfare state. Because after all, Americans love a generous welfare state without the explicit tax burden. Then President Richard Nixon effectively ended whatever was left of the gold standard, which, coupled with increased government spending, led to massive amounts of inflation in the U.S. economy. Also in 1970, Freddie Mac was established as another government-sponsored enterprise in effort to alleviate thrift banks. Meaning by this point, the federal government was now backing two government-sponsored enterprises on the secondary mortgage market, who would now try to raise money for mortgages with mortgage-backed securities. The 1970s would also see the passage of the Community Reinvestment Act, which was passed to alleviate the damage caused by the New Deal-era housing policies that led to stuff like redlining and racial discrimination in the housing market, but in general would give regulators even more control over housing. Around this period, the Securities and Exchange Commission would create an oligopoly of ratings agencies between Moody's, Fitch, and Standard & Poor's, while requiring certain large players in the financial market, notably state-funded and state-run pension plans, only invest in securities and bonds approved by said ratings agencies. And then came the 1980s, where the Federal Reserve, whose role expanded to missions like reducing inflation and reducing unemployment, began to increase interest rates dramatically in effort to cool off inflation. The interest rate increases ended up crushing savings and loan banks, and eventually prompted the federal government to come to the rescue, costing taxpayers over $120 billion. The 1980s also saw the failure of large banks like Continental Illinois, the largest bank failure in history at the time, requiring a takeover by FDIC by infusing the bank with $5.5 billion in new capital and $8 billion in emergency loans, solidifying the policy of too big to fail in the process, signaling to the industry that the federal government might just spend billions of dollars to bail out a failed bank if regulators think that wider economic ramifications are at stake. And now we're at the 1990s. For those keeping score, here's a rundown of some of the government agencies involved with banking and housing at this point. We have the Federal Reserve, FDIC, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, Ginnie Mae, HUD, the Securities and Exchange Commission, along with various regulations like Glass-Steagall and the Community Reinvestment Act, not to mention various regulations and regulatory agencies dealing with housing and finance at the state level. According to Peter J. Wallison's dissent in the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission reports, the Housing Community and Development Act of 1992 ultimately required Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to reduce mortgage underwriting standards when purchasing loans from originators, in effort to make homeownership more affordable to low-income and moderate-income borrowers. According to both John Allison and Thomas Sowell, the Department of Housing and Urban Development was lobbying for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to increase the amount of subprime loans they had on their portfolios. By 1999, President Bill Clinton got behind the idea of the government-sponsored enterprises having half of their portfolios consisting of loans made to low-income and moderate-income borrowers. Another thing that happened during the Clinton administration was the passage of the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, which many point to as the dastardly deregulation that caused the financial crisis because it repealed Glass-Steagall, when in reality, all it did was keep Glass-Steagall in place while allowing banks to be affiliated with securities firms. And as Don Watkins notes, the previous version of Glass-Steagall would not have prevented any of the activity leading up to the financial crisis, especially when you consider that some of the major banks that failed were pure investment banks, unaffiliated with depository institutions. By the early 2000s, the Federal Reserve, who was chaired by Alan Greenspan, who once upon a time was a student of philosopher Ayn Rand, before deciding one day that he wanted to become a villain from one of her novels, would lower interest rates in effort to stimulate a sluggish economy, which would spike the demand for home purchases, with customers looking to get in on cheaper mortgage interest rates. Thomas Sowell speculates that this probably also had an impact on well-off Americans, who could already afford to own a home, but wanted to buy even larger and nicer homes that they otherwise would not afford. It was around this time that the George W. Bush administration doubled down on the Clinton-era mission to make housing more affordable for low-income buyers, notably with the passage of the American Dream Down Payment Assistance Act.
The 43rd President of the United States, George W. Bush, you write, quote, President George W. Bush joined the push for more home ownership, close quote.
Yes.
I do believe in the American dream. I believe there is such a thing as the American dream. And I believe those of us who have been given positions of responsibility must do everything we can to spotlight the dream and to make sure the dream shines in all neighborhoods, all throughout our country. Owning a home is a part of that dream. It just is. Right here in America, if you own your own home, you're realizing the American dream.
But he wanted the federal government, particularly the Federal Housing Administration, to make loans so that people could buy a house without a down payment. He thought a down payment was just one of those fussy things that the market had come up with, you know, and as so often happens.
You're being very rough on him. This was the compassionate part of compassionate conservatism.
First, the single greatest barrier to first-time home ownership is a high down payment. It is really hard for many, many low-income families to make the high down payment. And so that's why I urge Congress to fully fund the American Dream Down Payment Fund. This will use money, taxpayers' money, to help a qualified low-income buyer make a down payment.
Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, what are they and what role did they play?
These are two government-sponsored enterprises which purchase mortgages from banks and other lenders. And so as these more risky mortgages come along, the banks don't hold on to those mortgages.
First of all, government-sponsored corporations that help create our mortgage system. I introduced two of the leaders here today. They call those people Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, as well as the federal home loan banks, will increase their commitment to minority markets by more than $440 billion.
In other words, the bank may lend to you or to me knowing that we are risky borrowers, but they sell the mortgage to Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac. They get their money right then and there, and it's up to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to collect on those mortgages over the next 30 years.
This means they will purchase more loans made by banks to African Americans, Hispanics, and other minorities, which will encourage home ownership.
This is the magic thing about politics. You set one goal and you don't worry about the repercussions.
I'm serious about this. This is a very important initiative for all of Americans. See it as a chance for us to empower people.
It's like Admiral Farragut saying, full steam ahead, damn the torpedoes.
Right.
And of course the torpedoes guide us.
So at this point, both political parties have made it a mission to intervene in the economy to make housing more affordable. As a result, America has a system where private banks are issuing mortgages to Americans and are well incentivized to make risky bets because a government-sponsored enterprise will happily take the risky loans off their hands in effort to get their quotas up. The banks also need not worry about screwing over other clients like depositors because of FDIC. And if a bank is large enough, they know there's a good chance the federal government will come to the rescue if their bank ultimately fails.
What could possibly go wrong?
Banks also offer what are called adjustable rates mortgages, wherein during low interest periods are appealing to people who might be willing to take advantage of low monthly payments for a few years if they think low interest rates will last forever, or perhaps they think they might make more money sometime in the near future, like say someone who's about to graduate college or is expecting a major promotion at work, and are willing to endure higher payments when they come. Or these borrowers simply got snookered by what many might consider to be predatory lending. Nevertheless, one group of people who found adjustable rate mortgages attractive were real estate speculators, especially during a period of low interest rates where housing prices kept going up and up and up and up with increasing demand. An adjustable rate mortgage is much more appealing when you're operating on the assumption that you're only going to make mortgage payments for a short period before selling the property that you bought at a profit. As Thomas Sowell talks about in his book, a lot of speculators were making good money during this period.
So that given lax lending standards, a speculator could come in and buy 4 or 5 expensive houses with a relatively small amount of money down, spruce them up and sell them within a very short time.
Meanwhile, private banks and private firms, along with government-sponsored enterprises, were getting further into the mortgage-backed securities market, packaging mortgages into securities and selling them to investors, which sounded like a wise investment because, hey, this is the American housing market we're talking about. What could be a safer bet than the American housing market? It probably did not help that the dot-com bubble burst and the Enron scandal also occurred during this period, which probably soured many Americans on investing in stuff like traditional stocks. Also, a lot of these mortgage-backed securities are rubber-stamped by the Securities and Exchange Commission's entrusted ratings agencies. Why would an SEC-entrusted rating agency rubber-stamp a risky security for investors? Well, as I mentioned earlier, in the 1970s, the SEC sanctioned Moody's, Fitch, and S&P as government-approved ratings agencies, while also requiring that public pension plans only buy bonds that are approved by said ratings agencies, in effort to protect worker pensions, which would have the effect of blocking competition from the ratings agency market and creating investor complacency. Additionally, Finally, according to John Allison, the SEC would also force the ratings agencies to change their compensation structures by shifting the cost of ratings from buyers to sellers at the behest of unions and pension plans, saying that the government-mandated issuer pay rules incentivized ratings agencies to lower their standards to please issuers, whereas before, the ratings agencies were more conservative. More broadly, John Allison also talks about how over-regulation may have caused a lot of consumer and investor complacency during this period, with many people assuming that the who's who of regulatory agencies were keeping a watchful eye on the banks and firms. It probably did not help that high-ranking politicians like Barney Frank and Christopher Dodd and Maxine Waters were either praising Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac during this period, or were dismissing warnings and concerns about the stability of the government-sponsored enterprises.
You absolutely suck!
Despite all of this, a handful of hedge fund investors like Michael Burry started to notice some troubling trends. Notably that a lot of mortgage-backed securities were risky due to the adjustable rate mortgages issued during low interest periods, and that once the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, a lot of people might begin to default on their mortgages, which will render a lot of mortgage-backed securities junk. I can only imagine what it was like being Michael Burry during this period. It must have been like watching one of those Titanic movies. Everyone is on the boat just having a wonderful time, being told that they're on some unsinkable ship. Meanwhile, the viewer is at home waiting forever and ever and ever for the boat to finally hit the iceberg before pandemonium ensues. Except for someone like Michael Burry, he has the potential to make ungodly amounts of money because he decided to bet against the Titanic housing market by purchasing credit default swaps, which act as insurance for risky investments. But who knows? Maybe house prices will continue to increase forever and ever. Maybe the hedge funds who loaded up on credit default swaps for mortgage-backed securities will end up looking foolish after giving insurance companies like American International Group easy money. But then, well, I'm sure you guys know what happens. After interest rates chilled in the basement at around 1% through the first half of 2004, the Federal Reserve began increasing interest rates again, eventually dialing rates up over 5% by 2006, and either as a result of the interest rate increases or by pure fucking coincidence for anyone who doubts the law of supply and demand, housing prices began to fall after 2006, meaning that anyone who purchased a home on one of those wonderful adjustable rate mortgages was in some serious trouble unless they were able and willing to endure higher mortgage payments. According to Peter J. Wallison, by 2008, there were 55 million mortgages in the United States, 31 million of which were considered subprime or risky. Of the 31 million mortgages, 76% were held by government agencies, primarily Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac.
Oh, SpaghettiOs!
Throughout 2007, mortgage defaults and foreclosures would steadily increase, reaching alarming rates, meaning that any bank or firm heavily invested in mortgage-backed securities was also in some serious trouble, along with any firms or insurance companies that sold credit default swaps on any mortgage-backed securities. Between February and March of 2007, 25 subprime lending firms would declare bankruptcy. By April, the New Century Financial Corporation would declare bankruptcy. By July, Bear Stearns would announce that 2 of its hedge funds had lost nearly all of their investor capital. On March 17th, 2008, with Bear Stearns on the verge of collapse, the Federal Reserve decided to bail out Bear Stearns by helping finance J.P. Morgan Chase's purchase of the troubled firm, with the Federal Reserve kicking in $30 billion. According to John Allison, this move signaled to the industry that the government would not let large banks fail, perhaps creating moral hazard amongst other firms like Lehman Brothers. Government bureaucrats like Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson, Federal Reserve Chair Ben Bernanke, and New York Federal Reserve Chair Timothy Geithner begin to worry that Bear Stearns represents a more systemic problem in the financial industry. The bailout of Bear Stearns came after Hank Paulson, who considered himself to be a free market Republican, persuaded Republican President George W. Bush to change his stance on bailouts, who did not want to bail out failed banks but came around on the idea out of fear of what might happen if Bear Stearns was allowed to fail. Other Republican bureaucrats like Neil Kashkari argued for bailouts for partially political reasons. Considering the possibility of Barack Obama winning the election and Obama maybe doing bailouts anyway, Kashkari figured it was better for the Bush administration to at least look like they made an effort to rescue the economy. On July 10th, with investors abandoning Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, it becomes hard to ignore the two government-sponsored enterprises are in serious trouble, with the former St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank president noting that Congress should recognize that the firms are insolvent. A few weeks later, Congress would pass the Housing and Economic Recovery Act, giving the U.S. Treasury unlimited investment authority in the government-sponsored enterprises. On September 6th, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac would be nationalized after the Federal Housing Finance Agency brought the two government-sponsored enterprises under a conservatorship, injecting them with $188 billion. On September 14th, Bank of America would announce that it is buying the troubled Merrill Lynch for $50 billion. This would be bad news for Lehman Brothers, who the following day would declare bankruptcy after spending months trying to find a merge partner or investor at a reasonable price, with Bank of America taking interest in Lehman Brothers before deciding to buy Merrill Lynch. Another such partner was Barclays, who was willing to buy Lehman Brothers until the deal was blocked by United Kingdom regulators. Unlike with Bear Stearns and the government-sponsored enterprises, the U.S. government decides to not come to Lehman's rescue out of fear of creating moral hazard, along with legal and political complications. The decision would ultimately cause panic in the market, as other large firms would experience runs on their money, further worrying bureaucrats and regulators that the entire financial system was on the brink of collapse and could potentially trigger another Great Depression. Barclays would end up acquiring Lehman's North American operations for $1.75 billion, which was a bargain considering that Lehman Brothers was worth $25 billion just a few months earlier. On September 16th, American International Group, the nation's largest insurance company, who had also assumed the risk of many credit default swaps, is bailed out on grounds that it is too big to fail, as the Federal Reserve would loan AIG $85 billion while the government took ownership stake in the company. Timothy Geithner invoked Section 13 of the Federal Reserve Act, which empowered the agency to lend to non-bank institutions under unusual circumstances. Some have reported that the cost of bailing out AIG would grow to over $180 billion. On September 19th, Hank Paulson would unveil the Troubled Asset Relief Program, also known as TARP, which, as the name suggests, is a plan for the U.S. government to purchase the troubled assets that are making it difficult for banks to operate. Earlier, when brainstorming possibilities, Paulson took inspiration from how Congress handled the savings and loan crisis of the 1980s, as Paulson's lawyers would seek to grant the Treasury Secretary near limitless discretion over how to administer the $700 billion program. On September 25th, FDIC would seize Washington Mutual. This would trigger investors at many large banks to make what are called silent runs, drawing their deposits down to the FDIC limit of $100,000. One such bank would be Wachovia, who would eventually be acquired by Wells Fargo. This happened after FDIC tried to broker a merger between Citibank and Wachovia, which did not make much sense considering that Citibank was doing worse than Wachovia financially, causing regulators to cancel the deal, signaling that regulators were both incompetent and untrustworthy. On October 3rd, Congress would pass the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act, which authorized Hank Paulson's TARP program. President George W. Bush would sign the act into law on the same day. Even healthy banks who did not want or need assistance, including JP Morgan Chase, decided to accept TARP money in effort to promote confidence in the financial system. Andrew Ross Sorkin's book, Too Big to Fail, features an exchange where the CEO of Wells Fargo is threatened by regulators into accepting TARP money, which he did not want for Wells Fargo. According to John Allison, the bank that he headed, BB&T, also did not need the money and opposed TARP, only deciding to accept money from the program after pressure from regulators. At one point, noting in his book that the Federal Reserve essentially forced all banks with over $100 billion to participate in the program. Government assistance loans through TARP was not exclusive to banks, as companies like General Electric, General Motors, and Chrysler would all seek and receive relief from the government. Many of these companies would end up paying the TARP money back to the government, with some seeing government bailouts as a success considering all of the jobs that were saved, along with the government seeing surplus revenues as a result. In the meantime, firms like Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley would convert to bank holding companies, which allowed them to receive loans from the Federal Reserve while also bringing them under the scope of Federal Reserve regulations. In the aftermath of the crisis, Congress, along with President Barack Obama, would pass new banking regulations, one of which would be Dodd-Frank, named after two of the politicians I mentioned earlier who were loud cheerleaders for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac before the two government-sponsored enterprises fell hard on their faces.
Barney Frank, George W. Bush, Alan Greenspan. Of those three, who was the worst actor?
Oh, Barney Frank, easily.
Okay, and of those three, whom does the press still listen to? And
Barney Frank.
I've abandoned free market principles to save the free market system.
I imagine by now some viewers might be thinking, wait a minute. If the financial crisis was caused by politicians intervening in the economy to make housing more affordable and resulted in the government getting further involved in finance in an effort to rescue the economy, then how in the hell did the free market get blamed?
You know, that's a really good question.
And how did this result in the economics wing of Reagan's coalition getting obliterated? You've probably heard the derogatory term ambulance chaser to describe certain lawyers who race to emergency rooms looking for victims to cash in on. Following the 2008 financial crisis, there was no shortage of politicians, commentators in the media, and high-profile intellectuals who were ready for some catastrophic event to blame on capitalism.
Mr. President, the current financial crisis facing our country should in fact put an end to almost any support for the extreme right-wing economic policies that President Bush has been pursuing for the last 8 years, and that in fact were pursued even before that. Those policies include unfettered free trade.
That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard, dude.
I imagine that a lot of these insufferable jackasses had waited a long time. With the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, showing that socialism could not even compete with a mixed economy, as the end of the Cold War was followed by an explosion in technological innovation and economic prosperity. There was so much excitement over the new millennium and what the future would bring. Hell, even Y2K was no match for whatever was left of the free market. Then 9/11 happened, and much of the focus on the political landscape shifted heavily to killing terrorists and preventing terrorism, rather than debates over capitalism versus socialism versus fascism, or some other stupid-ass third-way approach to economics. Then 2008 finally rolls around, and hooray, there's a severe economic crisis that involves Wall Street and finance. A crisis that's difficult for most people to comprehend. I mean, even I still have a hard time wrapping my mind around all the details after reading multiple books, reports, and news articles, along with listening to lectures from professionals on the topic and watching a few documentaries. Given the complexity of the issue, it's not hard to sell people on the idea that capitalism caused the crisis. All you gotta do is point to a few provisions of Glass-Steagall that were repealed, and point to the sitting president, George W. Bush, who came from the political party that, at least in rhetoric, championed free markets and deregulation and tax cuts, and also talk about some fat cats on Wall Street screwing things up. This narrative is especially emphasized in Michael Moore's movie Capitalism: A Love Story, which came out during the fallout of the crisis. What's often forgotten about George W. Bush was that when it came to economics, he had shifted away from the free market and fiscal reform ideas of the Reagan Revolution, instead presenting himself as a compassionate conservative.
This was the compassionate part of compassionate conservatism.
Aside from trying to make housing more affordable, George W. Bush and Congress would also pass new regulations on corporations and finance, notably with Sarbanes-Oxley. The Patriot Act would also impose new regulations on banks that were geared toward stopping terrorism. President Bush would also help expand Medicare and pass the Renewable Fuel Standard. This might partially explain why conservatives and Republican types had a real tough time standing up to the intellectuals who were swift to scapegoat capitalism and corporate greed for the financial crisis. Many conservatives probably spent the Bush years talking about how amazing and wonderful President Bush was and constantly defending his policies, meaning that properly standing up to the blame capitalism crowd would require admitting that President Bush was a massive failure on economics. On top of that, many of Bush's cheerleaders, notably the neoconservatives, were not free market absolutists, only cheering capitalism on when it was politically expedient and pushing capitalism aside whenever it got in the way of their agenda. And it's not like the Bible-thumping religious conservatives were gonna suddenly talk about how the real problem was a lack of freedom on Wall Street and in banking, considering that usury is condemned multiple times in the Bible, along with the fact that getting rich is at odds with the teachings of Jesus Christ. All that said, one has to wonder if Reagan's three-legged stool coalition was sustainable in the long run. Even President Bush, at times in his book, throws deregulation and corporate greed under the bus. The only ones who seemed interested in this battle were a handful of free market-oriented economists and intellectuals, who were a microscopic portion of the culture. It probably did not help that by 2009, conservatives had to focus on challenging the charismatic, hip-with-the-youth new President Barack Obama and his agenda, that they probably were not too interested in litigating the causes of the financial crisis. Even beyond that, conservatives at this point had become much more interested in culture war issues than boring stuff like economics. If you're a conservative, why bother getting into the minutia of New Deal era regulations and their impact on the new millennium economy, when you can just crusade against same-sex marriage instead? All you gotta do is thump your Bible and say stuff like God created Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. Simple stuff. Don't bother conservatives with charts and graphs about mortgage-backed securities. They're busy trying to bring the 10 Commandments into public schools along with other government buildings, gosh darn it. And perhaps the conservatives' obsession over culture wars would be a reason why they eventually shifted to populism on economics. Even someone like Turning Point USA's Charlie Kirk, who once upon a time presented himself as some sort of principled advocate for free markets, ultimately lost the will to defend the rights of big corporations who promote left-wing values.
There were some benefits to the tax bill. I think it unnecessarily pandered to big corporations that hate our values. I'll be very honest. Corporations hate conservative values. A lot of them are incredibly woke. Why we went out of our way to try to lower corporate tax rates that hate us is beyond me.
Such sentiment has been reflected by Republican senators like Tom Cotton.
They probably shouldn't come and ask Republican senators to carry the water for them whenever our Democratic friends want to regulate them or block their mergers. So I've heard a lot of questioning about that today, and I've read a lot about it in the news. And I'll say this, I'm sorry that's happening to you. Best of luck.
With the Bush years officially over, the only leg left standing from Ronald Reagan's three-legged stool coalition was the spiritual leg, supported by the religious right, with the foreign policy leg and the economics leg both obliterated. It was time for new stools, tea parties, and culture wars. And conservatives needed new ideas, new friends, and new thought leaders to guide them into the future. Now, whether or not the future looks bright for conservatives is a different question.
This was at the compassionate part of compassionate conservatism.